You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
Are you going to keep sending weapons to Ukraine, or are you going to turn off the tap soon?
Well, we're looking at that. We're talking to Zelensky. We're going to be talking with President Putin very soon, and we'll see how it all happens. We're going to look at it very soon. One thing I do feel, the European Union should be paying a lot more than they're paying, because under Biden, I mean, we're in there for $200 billion more. Now, it affects them more than it affects us. We have an ocean in between, right? Little thing called an ocean. The European Union should equalize. We're in there for $200 billion more than the European Union. I mean, what are we, stupid? I guess the answer is yes, because they must think so. But the European Union takes advantage of us tremendously on trade, and they now take advantage of, and always have. If I didn't get involved years ago, my first term, one of the first things I noticed was that they're not paying enough. They're not paying. And a lot of those countries weren't even paying. The NATO countries, they weren't paying. Only 7 out of 28 were paying. We were one of them. And Poland was one. And they had a few of them that were paying, and some were paying very proudly. Usually the closer to the borderline of Russia they were, the faster they paid, okay? The ones that were further away tended not to pay so fast. And one thing on that, I think they should lift their number not to 2%, but to 5%. NATO should be at 5%, not at 2%. 2% is ridiculous, yeah.
Did you ask President Xi in your conversation about Ukraine, you asked him to get involved in helping settle that? Can you tell us about that?
I did, yeah. I said, you ought to get it settled, because he's not done very much on that. He's got a lot of power. Like we have a lot of power. I said, you ought to get it settled. We did discuss it, yeah.
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely. But I put more sanctions on Russia than anyone else. I gave Ukraine javelins while Obama gave them blankets. You remember this statement? Oh, he's terrible. He's giving javelins, and the other one's giving blankets. Well, it turned out I was right when I gave the javelins. I was the one that gave them the weaponry to do that very big and important first part of the war and show something very special. Remember this also with Putin. You know, they like to say, oh, Trump was soft. I was tougher on Russia than anybody in history, with the sanctions and everything else.
You said you could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours.
Yes, I could.
How would you do that?
I know Zelensky very well. I felt he was very honorable, because when they asked him about the perfect phone call that I made, he said it was indeed perfect. He said it was, he didn't even know what they were talking about. He could have grandstanded, oh, I felt threatened.
Well, that's not going to be enough for Putin to stop bombing Ukraine.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well, even better. And I had a good relationship, very good, with both of them. I would tell Zelensky, no more. You got to make a deal. I would tell Putin, if you don't make a deal, we're going to give them a lot. We're going to give them more than they ever got if we have to. I will have the deal done in one day. One day.
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.